Everybody, and you're very welcome to the UCD's Institute of Food and Health Research Bites. And this morning, our research bites will be delivered by Dr. Fiona Lalor. So Fiona is an assistant professor in the School of Agriculture and Food Science, and there she's the program director of the online MSc in Food, Nutrition and Health. And she also coordinates an industry-orientated professional diploma in food safety and quality. Her expertise is in the area of food regulation and food policy, with her PhD from UCD in food regulation from the School of Public Health. Her research interest is in the area of nutrition and health claims, their general use in the marketplace, and the impact of nutrition and health claims on consumer purchasing behaviour. Before she took up her current post in UCD, Fiona worked as the Regulatory Affairs and Corporate Communications Manager in the Enterprise Ireland Technology Centre Food for Health of Ireland. So over to you, Fiona.
Great, thanks, Dolores. Hi, everybody. Good morning. I hope your Monday is going well. I will just get started. We'll just go straight for it. That suits everybody. Okay, so today I'm going to be not going to be talking about nutrition and health claims. So I've moved on to discuss something else, which is a project that and what I want to do this morning is tell you about what I'm going to be doing. This is a new project that we're about to commence, hopefully after the summer. So I want to talk to you a little bit about food fraud and Brexit and the impact that Brexit has had or is likely to have, continue to have on the food industry in terms of food fraud and fraudulent behaviour. So in order to understand that, we need to look at, I hate people always defining things, and it gets very monotonous. But that said, you need to understand what food fraud means. The challenge is that there isn't a regulatory definition of food fraud. And there are those on one side of the fence who would say there's no need, that all aspects of food fraud are all automatically covered by the regulation anyway. So in terms of food safety, in terms of misrepresentation and labelling, that should all be covered by existing food safety or food legislation. But the downside of not having a definition for food fraud is the challenge then in pursuing cases in court if you don't have a definition. So there's two sides to that coin. But at the moment, a technical working group of the Codex Alimentarius came together and established what they have kind of called a working definition of food fraud, which is that any deliberate action of businesses or individuals to deceive others in regards to the integrity of food to gain undue advantage, and gave examples, or not really examples, types of food fraud like adulteration, substitution, dilution, tampering, etc. Now, there's two key aspects to that definition that are really important in terms of understanding what this means. And they are, firstly, that food fraud is committed deliberately. I think we have to accept that we're all human and mistakes happen, and that sometimes food safety errors occur in terms of food production. So sometimes there is cross-contamination, sometimes labeling of foodstuffs does not happen properly, and there's a degree of human error in that. But when we're talking about food fraud, it's a deliberate intention. And the other aspect of this that I want you to, as I said, there's two things. The second is that food fraud is only motivated by financial gain. There's no other motivation. It's not with a view to injuring or making people ill. That's a whole other ballgame. There's all sorts of definitions of food crime. But in terms of food fraud, it's deliberately conducted and it's done with an intention to gain financially. That's the motivating factor behind it. So, examples of what we mean when I talk about food fraud, I just picked three. The first one is an old one, took place in 1981 in Spain, where industrial rapeseed oil was contaminated with aniline and was then called olive oil, subsequently brought to market and called olive oil. Over 1,000 people died from an allergic reaction to the aniline. So that was a food fraud issue, but also became a food safety one. Likewise, probably the most famous global incident of food fraud was in China in 2008, where melamine, which is a protein, was added to boost protein content. In China, infant formula producers receive a subsidy based on the protein content of their infant formula. So the fraudsters in China contaminated their product with melamine to boost the protein content and to increase their subsidy, not knowing that, well, maybe they did, but ultimately that 50,000 children were hospitalized in China as a result of this contamination. And a number of babies died. Culprits were arrested and 2 of them were executed. So the impact of, and the other side of that incident, in fact, wasn't even just the food safety aspect of it. which was probably, critically the most important, if you like. But the other aspect was huge, because the Chinese parents began to completely doubt the integrity and safety of the Chinese home-produced infant formula. So they turned to imported product, which boded well for us in Ireland because we were able to supply a certain degree of that. But it absolutely decimated the domestic producers of infant formula in China. And so the impact was very, very, very far-reaching. And it's beginning to improve again in terms of domestic production of infant formula in China. But they turned exclusively to foreign sources in order to feed their babies. And the third example that I've given you is one that we may in Ireland be possibly most familiar with, is where beef burgers, initially identified here, but subsequently identified all over Europe, were actually tested positive for, rather than being beef burgers, or it wasn't just beef burgers, it was Alan is on the call, so he's an expert on this whole issue. It wasn't just beef burgers, it was also ready meals that had beef, minced beef in particular, were contaminated with horse meat, and they were tested positive for equine DNA. And while the third case there didn't really become a food safety issue, anything like the incidence of the others, the impacts were still felt very, very far-reaching, huge, because it was, as I say, identified here, and then they subsequently discovered that in fact it was all over Europe. So the impacts of food fraud are very far-reaching. The harms are economic to consumers because you're not buying what you think you're buying, to honest purveyors of food. So the honest industry is obviously hugely damaged by fraudulent behaviour, and the food industry and the integrity of the food industry in general can be potentially very damaged by food fraud. It can have clearly direct and indirect potential public health and food safety problems. And the third one, and these are only examples because the harms are very far-reaching, these are only examples of what it can do, is a systemic harm that undermines the confidence in the government's ability to regulate food. And that's really, really important. That's a similar thing that happened with the BSE crisis, is that once the consumer and the industry, or not the industry, well, the industry to an extent, I suppose, but really the consumer and the public begin to doubt the ability of the regulators to look after the food that they supply, it can have very, very damaging effects. So those are the kinds of how it can the ripple effects of food fraud. But regulating for that is notoriously difficult. The very nature of food fraud is that it is clandestine, illegal, under the radar, very difficult to capture data about the type and the scope, and how many incidents of food fraud take place per year, for example, is an inordinately difficult figure to capture. The elusive nature of that, as I said, I just gave you 3 examples, but it's much broader than that, and it can have, you're dealing with a very nebulous concept. And really, as Alan said one time, that the importance, if you're going to try and combat this, trying to regulate for this, you need to get into the mindset of the individuals who conduct this. So there's a lot more than just food safety going on here. It's a lot more under the radar. It's a crime. And the other aspect of the challenge when you're regulating for food fraud is the global dimension of the food chain. It's extraordinarily complex, the supply and where we get the ingredients in the foods that we consume, not just here, but everywhere. And as long as the food chain, if you want to call it a chain, gets broader and wider and messier and more complex, the more difficult it is to regulate for food fraud. One of the aspects that should be possible is the inspection. And you inspect product moving from one jurisdiction to another, you should be able to have some sort of control over the potential food fraud behaviour. So those inspections are very important. These inspections take place at border control posts. So when food is moving from one jurisdiction to another, ideally you get food products that are either imported live products or animal products are inspected at border control posts. They can only enter the EU if they've undergone specific checks and they have the required documentation. Each EU member state has its own veterinary designated border control posts, and only product arriving from a third country, this is a really important aspect to this project, is only product arriving from a third country, i.e. outside of the EU, requires these safety and documentation checks, and there's no need for inspection if they have already passed through an EU check. So once you're in the EU, you're good to go. You don't need to go through this process. The reason we're talking about it now is our old friend Brexit, and the complexity that brings to bear. And I won't bore you all with all the details of that. We all know that the UK exited the EU in the beginning of January, finally exit day. The Withdrawal Act provided for this transition period, but that was up on the 31st of January, or the 31st of December rather, with the exception that this is another thing I want you to be cognizant of, is that we don't want to go down. Obviously, the protocol on Northern Ireland is an extraordinary complex issue, and it's hugely political. It's a political hot potato that I don't want to get this project dragged into. So what we're going to be looking at is the bigger picture in terms of Irish businesses that buy food products from the UK, place them on the Irish market. They now need to impose the rules for importing food from outside the state or outside the single market. And businesses wishing to sell food in the UK need to adhere to rules for exporting outside of the single market. So we're trying to just look at Ireland versus as part of the EU versus the United Kingdom. So to give you a sort of an example, or to show really what used to happen. In Ireland, we have a number of border control posts, which I'm going to talk to you through a little bit. But they were import and export ports where product moved. And what typically we would do, and what typically we would love to remain to do, is to export product primarily from Dublin or Rosslare in through to Liverpool or Holyhead, use the UK land bridge, and then export to the rest of the UK, use some of these ports to get our product to the rest of Europe. But now, because the United Kingdom is considered a third country, the question remains, is it better to cross here, go through the land bridge and deal with these European ports, plus all the paperwork and headache of the documentation checks that are required to do that? Or is it easier for the industry to go around and about? And what we want to do, I suppose, is to explore all of that, the milieu that is that. How are they doing it, and what's the best way to go about it? These are just some examples. I always think of Lego bricks when I look at these. These are the containers. So when we talk about border inspection posts, border control posts, and what needs to be inspected, it's the product that is inside these little Lego blocks. And we import, as you know, in these containers is everything that we use as consumer goods, whether it's furniture, clothing, material, stationery. They all come through into these containers and into the country and onwards. And when they contain food, they need to be inspected. And over to the right is that's a container load that arrived into Rosslare, and underneath it is also an image of Rosslare. But that's the size and the scale of what we're talking about, which is absolutely enormous. I think the one to the left is Rotterdam, which is one of the busiest, if not the busiest port in the world. So product moves, and it's a lot of product. It's not something, it's almost incalculable and unimaginable, the volume that we're talking about. So what we want to know is, do they inspect that now? What's really happening? In Ireland, as I said, we have 4 border inspection posts. We have Dublin Port, where there's no live animals, but you can take in food products and animal products for human consumption. In Dublin Airport, in terms of live animals, it's horses only, and likewise Shannon Airport. So we do have different capacities in different airports. And as a result of Brexit, Rosslare, significant investment was put into Rosslare Port to make it bigger and make it able to cope with the increase of volume of product that's going to be moving from Ireland to the EU and elsewhere and onward. So that's what the Irish border situation looks like. As I say, I'm not going to get bogged down in what goes on up here between the North and the Republic. That's a political situation that's kind of not something I want to get dragged into, because that's not really what this project is about, even though we need to be cognizant of it. So just to go back to this image again, I just want we've done a couple of, what's the word I'm looking for, it's going out of my head, pilot studies for this project that were done with the Food Safety Authority funding before Christmas. And we interviewed a number of food businesses to see what the impact of Brexit is in terms of their work and where they take in product and how that operates. And having spoken to some of the larger retailers, we know that product coming from the UK into Ireland, if it's coming into the Republic of Ireland, it comes in either at Dublin Port or Rosslare, and it stays here. If it's destined for Northern Ireland, it comes into Larne, up at the north outside Belfast, and it stays in there. And that's the key. Is it's for some of those big retailers, they invested millions in reorganizing and rerouting their product and where it goes to. And that's fine for the big guys. But I have another study ongoing up at UU at the moment with a particular, we're looking at small SMEs, small to medium enterprises, to see what the impact for them is. It's one thing for the likes of Tesco to reroute where their product is coming into. It's a whole other ballgame for the smaller guys to do the same thing. And so what we want to know is where there is rerouting, where there is changing, where there's a shift and a change in regulatory requirements and in inspection protocols, what does that mean for the food fraudsters? Is it an open policy now? Are they in a much stronger position to carry out food fraud because nobody's watching? So the aim of the research project is to understand the impact on food fraud that Brexit has had on the key players of the food chain, including food producers and consumers. And so that's the overall what we're trying to do. We want to see what checks are currently being done in moving product from the Republic of Ireland to the UK and back again. Have companies found alternative routes to market or even alternative markets altogether? I know there's a significant increase in the amount of pork product that is now being imported into Ireland from the Netherlands versus the UK in the last 3 to 4 years. So there has been a change in where we're now sourcing product. Product that used to come from the UK no longer does so, now comes from Brussels or from the Netherlands. So those kinds of things, those little tweaks, we wanted to try and understand what the market looks like. If inspection protocols have changed, has the situation changed regarding the risk of food fraud? And and this is a key question that I know the regulators, the word is, I don't mean that they're nervous, they're not nervous necessarily about it, very concerned about it. And certainly for the industry, the notion of regulatory divergence is really important. So as time progresses, and I mean time over the next 20 years, the UK regulatory regime for food safety, food inspection, food authenticity, that is going to change, going to deviate from what's happening currently in the EU. And as long as that continues to happen, we in Ireland could likely be very affected by that in terms of our industry's capacity to supply the UK. So what we need to know is what are the UK likely to do differently compared to what we are doing. And as the divergence takes place over time, that's going to be very important. So we need to try and understand how we're going to monitor that and how what the impact that will have in terms of inspections. We also want to know about consumers and what do they think of the risks to food fraud, and do they believe the risk of exposure to food fraud has been increased or decreased as a result of Brexit. So we have 2 projects. The plan is firstly to identify where in the food chain these changes exist, which foods on the market in Ireland, both north and south of the border, are most susceptible to food fraud. We do know from studies that have been conducted and published that honey, wine and spirits are the most hit by food fraud. So they're the most exposed to food fraud at the moment. But what we want to know is that's still true for our jurisdiction. And then once we understand that, what the key issues might be in Ireland is to examine the marketplace, to identify key vulnerable categories and where they come from. And then the second project is to identify consumer attitudes towards food fraud and the impact of Brexit. And if consumer trust has increased, in trust both with the industry and with the regulators, whether that has increased, plateaued, or remained steady post-Brexit. And we want to know if the consumer experience can contribute in some way to policy and can improve consumer protection from food fraud in the future. So that's what the 2 projects look like. At the moment, we've identified a collaboration with Dr. Sinead Fury in the University of Ulster. We've been awarded funding from the Higher Education's North-South Research Fund, and we're currently recruiting 2 MSc students with an aim to start in September. So that's all I wanted to say to you this morning. Thank you.